Welcome to Cheating Tales Diary. Before we dive into today's story, we have a humble request. Please consider subscribing to this new channel. Help us hit our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Your support will motivate us to keep bringing you more exclusive original cheating wife stories. And now, let's get started with today's story. There was a silence in the house, the kind that only settles when the walls have heard something they can't repeat. In that two-story home in Seattle, the evening light bounced off the walls and landed on a photo frame, the one with Chelsea and Dave on their wedding day. The same frame Dave had mounted himself, carefully, with a level and a small hammer. But now, to Chelsea, it was just a thing from the past, a memory she'd thought about taking down many times, but never quite had the courage to. The only sounds were the ticking clock and the soft, steady rhythm of someone's breathing, rising from John's chest. He was sitting on the living room couch, like an actor waiting for his cue. And Chelsea? She stood near the door, holding her breath, her heart pounding like a fist against her ribs. She knew Dave was about to walk in. Any moment now. The sound of Dave's car stopped outside the door. Chelsea clenched and unclenched her fingers. John looked at her, gave a faint smile. But Chelsea didn't look back. She was afraid that if she met his eyes, he'd see the weakness in hers. The door opened. The steps of a tired man entered, his shoes pausing on the doormat. As always, Dave hung up his coat, dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl. He glanced toward the kitchen, then stepped into the living room. John was already standing. Chelsea held her breath. This was the moment. Dave's eyes landed on John. No shock, no panic. Just a look. Like flipping through an old book you once knew by heart. "Hey, Dave," John said, his voice carrying an awkward hesitation. Dave didn't respond. He walked forward a bit, stopping by his usual spot, the recliner, and glanced up at the photo frame, the one of him and Chelsea, standing on a Caribbean beach, soft sunlight behind them, both smiling. Chelsea suddenly realized her smile in that photo looked fake. Maybe it always had been. Dave reached up and slightly straightened the frame, then stepped back and stared at it, like someone adjusting a detail and stepping back to see the whole picture again. Chelsea took a step forward and began, "Dave, we need to talk." Dave's eyes stayed on the frame. He nodded once, then said, "Then talk." John looked at Chelsea. She steadied herself and slowly walked to the sofa, the same spot where she and Dave used to sit on Friday nights. Close. Sometimes very close. "I know this is sudden," Chelsea began, her voice damp with guilt. "But John and I—" Dave finally looked at her. No emotion on his face. Chelsea felt like she was speaking to a wall. "We've fallen in love," she said, her voice trembling. "And I want a divorce." There was a long pause. Dave reached into his pocket and took out a handkerchief. He wiped both hands with it, like brushing off dust that needed to go. Then just one sentence. "All right, Chelsea." Her eyes widened, like she'd just been struck by lightning. No yelling, no questions, just those 3 words, sharper than any scream. John stepped forward. "Dave, I know this is—" Dave turned to him, a long, cold stare. "You don't need to understand, John," Dave said, his voice flat. "You just need to remember, the woman you're doing this for was once the wife of the man who trusted you." John looked down. Chelsea rested her hands on her knees, suddenly feeling incredibly small. "Dave, I'm not lying. This wasn't impulsive. I've thought about it deeply. I just didn't want to hurt you, or myself, any more than we already were." Dave gave a faint smile, barely there. Then he said, "Is that why you kept it hidden for 15 months? Chelsea opened her mouth, but no words came out. "You remember?" Dave said, taking his first step forward. When you told me you were going on that girls' trip to San Diego, that night I asked you for soup. Do you remember that? Chelsea blinked. I, you told me you didn't have time, Dave finished. I believed you. But that night, you were in a hotel room with John. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. John had taken a step back now. He stood against the wall as if trying to disappear. Chelsea's voice trembled. You tracked us? Dave shook his head. Number, I just watched closely. Your smile didn't have the same warmth anymore. Your I love you felt thin. He turned again to the frame on the wall. And I just needed to understand. When you started giving someone else what used to be mine. Chelsea looked at him. His face showed no tears, just stillness. That eerie kind of peace that feels more dangerous than rage. Like a storm choosing its path in silence. Dave spoke again, softly. I wasn't asking for soup, Chelsea. I was checking if you were still mine. And that night, I got my answer. Chelsea was shaking now. She looked at John, then back at Dave. I'm sorry, she said, for the first time with a cracked, uneven tone. Dave didn't reply. He reached up, adjusted the frame again, and said, I'll keep this. It's part of the marriage, and every experiment needs a baseline. Chelsea didn't fully understand what he meant, but she knew. Dave had just said something far bigger than she could grasp. And this was only the beginning. Chelsea never imagined that saying the words, I want a divorce, would be met with just a calm, all right, Chelsea. She'd prepared herself for everything, yelling, swearing, accusations, broken glass. But Dave's silence, it cut straight through her soul. For several minutes, the air in the living room felt heavier, like the walls were closing in inch by inch. Chelsea tried to convince herself that maybe Dave was in shock, that maybe he'd explode later. But when he walked into the kitchen, made himself coffee, and quietly went into his study without another word, she realized she was in a war, where the weapons weren't fists or fury, but silence. John whispered, He's really calm. That's kind of terrifying. Chelsea nodded, but her breath was shallow and uneven. She suddenly remembered something. Dave's old pattern. When he got angry, he got quiet. Once, a mechanic overcharged him $800 on a repair. Dave didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply took the invoice home. And by the next morning, he'd contacted the regional manager of the entire auto shop chain. That mechanic lost his job. Chelsea felt a chill down her spine. The next morning, Dave was in full routine. He made breakfast, even left a plate of toast for Chelsea, and then, like nothing had happened, dropped the kids off at school. But Chelsea couldn't focus on anything. She hadn't slept all night. Her mind kept racing, trying to figure out what Dave was thinking. Did he really accept all this as okay? Or was he planning something? That evening, when Dave came home, Chelsea didn't wait. How are you so calm, Dave? She asked. I just told you I'm leaving you. For someone else. As Dave hung his coat on the rack, he answered, Because you're leaving for yourself, Chelsea. I can't stop you. And maybe I don't want to. Chelsea's voice cracked again. I'm not a liar, Dave. I couldn't live the lie anymore. That's why I told you. Dave gave a slight nod, like he had come to terms with all of this a long time ago. When a confession isn't made out of guilt, but out of relief, Dave said, it stops being honest. You didn't say this for me, Chelsea. You said it for yourself. Chelsea's face darkened. She tensed up, going straight into defense. I gave you 28 years. I've always been there for you. Dave turned to her, speaking for the first time in a firm but calm voice. You didn't give me 28 years, Chelsea. You gave them to yourself. for the image, the comfort. And when something new came along, when you felt that thrill, you decided my role was done. Don't do that, Chelsea said, her voice shaking. Don't twist my choices into something ugly. I'm not twisting anything, Dave replied. I'm just observing, the way I always do. That last sentence pierced Chelsea somewhere deep inside. The way I always do. Had he noticed before? Had he known? She asked, How long have you known? Dave looked into her eyes. Long enough. Chelsea's breath caught. Then why didn't you ever confront me? Dave's reply was quiet, but to Chelsea it fell like a rock. Because I believe more in patterns than in reactions. Tears began to well in her eyes, a flood of guilt and confusion. Sitting down on the couch, she said, I was confused, Dave. John gave me attention that maybe I wasn't getting from you. You wanted attention, huh? Dave said, his voice razor sharp. Not presence, not respect, just attention. And you took it, without thinking what it might cost. Chelsea was on the verge of breaking down. If you want to hate me, I understand. Dave cut her off gently. No, Chelsea. Hatred is a luxury I won't give you. I just needed clarity. And now I have it. He walked over to his study door, opened it, then paused, turning back toward her. Oh, and tell John, the blue tiles in his new apartment, the grout's faulty. He'll have a leak soon. Chelsea's jaw dropped. How do you even know his address? Dave didn't answer. He just smiled and stepped into his study. Chelsea's hands began to tremble. She couldn't tell if that was just a random observation or something else. But one thing was suddenly crystal clear. Dave knew something. Maybe everything. And his silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. That was the moment Chelsea realized. Dave's revenge had already begun, and he didn't need to lift a finger to start it. She had never imagined that telling the truth could feel this heavy. For days, she'd felt a strange lightness. The hope of finally living freely with John, the relief of dropping the guilt. But now, that weight had shifted. Not gone, just transformed. And it was pressing down on her chest with every quiet move Dave made. Now, Dave absorbed everything like he already knew it. There were no more questions in his eyes, only answers. And that unsettled Chelsea more than any argument ever could. John kept telling her, Dave's just putting on a front. It's a defense mechanism. He's trying to look strong. But Chelsea knew better. This wasn't a performance. Dave was doing something she couldn't see. One night, Chelsea sat alone in the kitchen. Dave walked in. He didn't say anything, just grabbed some juice from the fridge and dropped an empty wine bottle into the recycle bin. Chelsea looked up. It was the same wine he used to open only for special occasions. You've been drinking? She asked. Dave shrugged. Just a glass, now and then. Then, after a pause, he said, Not much reason to hold back anymore, right? Chelsea replied softly, You talk like it's all over. Dave smiled, that faint smile that had started to scare her. Sometimes, he said, the end is just where it begins. There was something in his voice, an undertone, like he was speaking in another context altogether. Chelsea's sleep had started to break. She would wake up at random hours. Sometimes Dave's room light would still be on. Sometimes she'd hear faint typing from the study. Once, she even caught him adjusting the hallway surveillance camera, without offering any explanation. She asked him, Why are you doing all this? Dave replied, Just upgrading. You know, I've always wanted a smart home, like the smart life you and John are building. It wasn't said with malice, but to Chelsea, it cut like a knife. One afternoon, when John came to pick Chelsea up, Dave was standing in the front lawn, pruning shears in hand, trimming the rose bushes. As soon as John stepped out of the car, he said, "Hey, Dave, beautiful yard." Dave turned back and said, "Thanks. Some things I prefer to handle myself, so I can pull the weeds out from the root." Chelsea couldn't even bring herself to look at him. As soon as they got into the car, John whispered, "Is it just me, or is he talking in metaphors now?" Chelsea didn't respond, but every word from Dave felt like a silent alarm ringing in her head. That evening, Chelsea stopped him near the hallway. "Are you still going to stay here until the divorce is finalized?" Dave replied, "It's my house. Bought it before the marriage. If you want to leave, you can." Frustrated, Chelsea snapped, "I can't believe you're punishing me like this." Dave stepped closer. There was no anger in his eyes, just a strange, unblinking firmness. "Punishment only works if someone's listening, Chelsea," he said. "I'm just being quiet." Chelsea's hands began to tremble. That night, she told John, "Something's wrong. Dave's not just watching. He's planning." John rolled his eyes. "He's about to be your ex-husband, Chelsea, not a CIA analyst." But Chelsea felt it. Dave had some kind of data, something that could expose both her and John. The next morning, while Dave was out, Chelsea slipped into the study. She rifled through drawers, checked his computer. Everything was password protected. But one thing chilled her. On the desk sat an old decorative baseball bat. It looked untouched at first, coated in a light layer of dust. But the lower half had clearly been wiped clean, like someone had held it recently. Her throat went dry. She quickly shut the room and backed away. Now it wasn't just guilt she was feeling. It was fear. Fear that Dave was watching her, listening, waiting. But for what? Later that night, as Chelsea passed by the study, she caught a glimpse through the slightly open door. Dave had an earbud in and was listening to something. His fingers were still. Her own fingers started to tremble. She texted John, "He knows more than he's letting on. I think he heard us." John replied, "You're being paranoid." But Chelsea knew. This wasn't paranoia. This was Dave's new face. The man who used to be a dependable husband had become something else. An observer. And maybe an executioner. When John held that light brown envelope, the one with the divorce papers inside, Chelsea had mentally prepared herself. To her, this was just a formality now. What she didn't know was that hidden inside this formality was a legally embedded explosion from Dave. It was 7 p.m. The house sat in that same familiar yet now deeply uncomfortable silence. John squeezed Chelsea's hand and said, "Let's just get this over with." Chelsea nodded and parked the car in the driveway. Dave happened to be coming in from the backyard at the same time. Leather gardening gloves in hand, and that same calm, cold restraint in his eyes that had become his new normal. Chelsea stepped forward and handed him the envelope. "These are the divorce papers." Dave took them without a word. He glanced at the documents the way a science student might examine a lab report, calm, methodical, detached. Without even flipping a page, he asked, "I assume you both sought legal counsel on this?" Chelsea replied, "Yeah, we kept it fair. Assets, mutual agreement, clean closure." Dave gave a faint smile. Clean closure. That's an interesting phrase. John opened his mouth to say something, but Dave cut him off without even looking his way. "Mr. Hollings, did you happen to review Seattle Family Court's most recent revision guidelines on marital asset transfers, particularly those involving premarital properties?" John was caught off guard. Uh, I, I thought this fell under shared assets." Dave now opened the envelope and pulled out a page casually. "Page 4, Section B," he said. "You both are assuming that this house, the one we're all currently standing in, qualifies as the marital home. But it was actually purchased using funds from my mother's inheritance. In 1993, 2 years before we were even married. Chelsea's eyes widened. Dave, you never mentioned that. You never asked, Dave replied. John quietly took out the documents and started reading Section B. A light sweat broke across his forehead as the reality sank in. Dave continued. As for the joint savings, your contribution stopped over a decade ago. Since then, the majority of that account has been funded through my consulting work. Every deposit is traceable. I've already submitted a full forensic breakdown to the court. It started to click for Chelsea. Dave wasn't just emotionally detached. He was strategically prepared. So, what are you saying? John asked, voice cracking. That she gets nothing? Dave stepped back slightly. I'm saying the court looks at facts, not feelings. Chelsea snapped. This is revenge, isn't it? Dave didn't stay silent this time. His voice was steady, but there was fire just beneath the surface. You slept beside me for 15 months while being in love with someone else. And now you're here lecturing me on fairness? I'm not seeking revenge, Chelsea. I'm reclaiming what you tried to quietly redefine behind my back. John had no words. Dave walked into his study and returned with another document, a notarized property certificate, and handed it to Chelsea. This is the house deed. It's in my name only. If you're planning to move, I'd suggest doing it sooner rather than later. Chelsea took the paper, but her hand was visibly shaking. Dave added, and by the way, all automatic payments tied to your account are canceled as of next month. That includes your phone plan and insurance. You said you're starting a new life, right? Time to embrace the responsibilities that come with it. Tears welled in Chelsea's eyes, but she held them back. Dave turned toward that same photo frame, the one from the Caribbean, and smiled. Oh, Chelsea, he said, remember that cruise? You thought it was just a romantic getaway. What you didn't know was I was field testing my firm's final surveillance prototype. The color drained from Chelsea's face. What? Dave slowly looked up at her. You'll understand. Very soon. John grabbed Chelsea's hand, and the two of them walked toward the door. As it shut behind them, Dave walked to his study and opened a file. Inside were neatly organized tabs. Chelsea. Phase 1. Documentation complete Phase 2. Exposure. Pending phase. 3. Reset. In progress. He took a deep breath, like a scientist who had just completed the riskiest phase of his hypothesis. Dave no longer looked like a broken husband. He looked like a master planner, soon to be known as Vanguardian. That one sentence, you'll understand, very soon, didn't let Chelsea sleep that night. The photo from the Caribbean cruise now seemed to look at her. Every time her eyes landed on that frame, it felt like she was in a surveillance room, and that picture was silently recording her every move. The next morning, John tried to comfort her. He's bluffing. Surveillance prototype? That was just a jab, meant to mess with your head. Chelsea whispered, No, John. He wasn't bluffing. He said it too precisely, like it was part of a larger plan. John exhaled sharply. Well, if he was testing a surveillance device back then maybe we were being watched. Chelsea turned to him, her voice low and cold. No, John, we weren't being watched. We were being recorded, probably for years. Later that day, Chelsea finally looked closely at the frame. She took it off the wall. Behind it was a dust panel. Something about it felt off. She gently scratched at it, flipped it over, and found a nearly invisible slit in the center. Using a nail, she pried it open, and what she found could have come straight out of a sci-fi film. A micro SD card, tucked inside a sealed compartment. Her hands trembling, she brought it to John. He inserted it into his laptop, and there it was. A folder with time-stamped sequences. 15 months of clips. Hotel rooms, phone calls, whisper-level conversations. Chelsea's face went pale. One of the clips played, her voice saying to John, "Sometimes I feel like Dave is too plain, too ordinary. Loving him feels like a routine." John immediately slammed the laptop shut. Jesus Christ. Chelsea sank onto the bed, barely breathing. He didn't just prepare legally, he built a damn dossier. Right then, a letter slid under the door. Chelsea picked it up quickly, a handwritten note from Dave. "Your expressions have been well archived. For archival purposes, naturally. Don't worry, I have no intention of using them, unless provoked." Chelsea went into panic mode. The next day, she stormed into Dave's study. "You spied on me?" Dave, seated calmly, just laughed. "Spying is done in secret, Chelsea. What I did was documentation, the same thing your attorney would do." Chelsea screamed, "This is an invasion of privacy." Dave looked her in the eyes. "You lost your privacy the moment you abandoned loyalty." A pause. Then Dave leaned in and said, "I recorded you because you stopped telling the truth. And when people lie, you don't confront them. You observe them, quietly." Chelsea staggered backward. She asked, "Where did you send those recordings?" Dave replied, "Nowhere. Not yet." Her voice barely holding together. "Will you delete them?" Dave didn't answer. He simply stood up and walked out of the study, leaving Chelsea standing there, with the crushing realization that every kiss, every lie, every moan had been cataloged. That night, John and Chelsea decided to move into a hotel. "We can't stay here," John said flatly. But while packing, Chelsea noticed that Dave had only taken a few old folders from their shared closet. Everything else was untouched. John muttered, "He's done with the house, but not with us." Chelsea looked at herself in the mirror. She was no longer the woman who had once felt powerful leaving Dave. Now, she was a character in someone else's experiment. That night, in the hotel room, John asked her, "Do you think he's still watching us?" Chelsea didn't answer, because she didn't know the answer herself. 4 years passed. Chelsea and John's relationship no longer thrived on passion. It ran on routine, guilt, and unspoken anxiety. They lived in a modest rental cottage just outside Seattle. No mortgage relief, rising energy bills, and a growing pile of silent resentments. John now worked at a startup. Frequent travel, long hours. The things that once felt like romantic escape now felt like exhaustion. And Chelsea? She was undergoing clinical visits, partly for mental health, partly for hormonal regulation. That day felt like just another medical errand. Chelsea had gone to a Planned Parenthood clinic for a standard procedure, to replace her contraceptive implant. But when the nurse ran a preliminary scan, something about her expression shifted. "Ma'am, you already have a subdermal implant. Did you have one inserted recently?" Chelsea blinked, confused. I used to. But I thought it expired 2 years ago. That's why I'm here." The nurse furrowed her brows. "It's still active, and it's not the standard model. We'll need the physician to take a closer look." A few minutes later, a doctor arrived. A calm woman in her late 40s, eyes curious but composed. "Ma'am," she said, "the device in your arm, it's not just a hormonal implant. It's something unfamiliar. It has secondary circuitry. I've sent the image to our lab technician and—" "Wait, what do you mean, secondary circuitry?" Chelsea's voice trembled. "It appears to be integrated with a biometric sensor, possibly GPS-enabled. It's a hybrid device. Definitely not approved by any FDA-regulated manufacturer. Do you remember where you got your implant?" Chelsea's breath caught in her throat. The cruise. Dave had called it a surprise upgrade, said it was European medical-grade tech. He'd arranged the procedure during vacation. It had stung a little, but he'd smiled and said, "It's all verified. I checked everything myself." And now, it was clear. For 4 years, Chelsea had been wearing a surveillance chip from Dave, inside her own body. The doctor made a note. "It's labeled Vanguardian 003A. That's not a known brand." Chelsea exhaled hard. The word hit her like a tidal wave. Vanguardian. That was the name Dave used on realbetrayal.com, the niche confession site where he read and shared hyper-detailed surveillance stories of cheating spouses. She remembered it now. Dave's late nights in the study, his obsession with that forum, his username, Vanguardian. Her heart pounded. She immediately called John, her fingers trembling. "John, we need to talk, now." When John got home, one look at Chelsea's face told him something was seriously wrong. "Dave chipped me," she said quietly. John froze. "What do you mean? Chipped you?" Chelsea held up the scan, the implant image, the embedded circuitry, and the label clear as day. John shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane. We need a lawyer, a private investigator, maybe the police." Chelsea's voice cracked. "He never wanted courtroom revenge, John. He wanted a living subject. I was his experiment." And then she said, "Remember that cruise photo? That wasn't just a vacation memory. That was the first frame of a project. I was the prototype." John stepped back, shaking his head. "We can't let him win. You are not some lab rat." But tears filled Chelsea's eyes. "Maybe I am," she whispered, "because the day I broke his trust was the day he turned me into a human experiment." A week later, Chelsea received an envelope, unmarked. Inside was an SD card, just one label. "Final archive, Vanguardian complete." John played it. Every folder was methodically arranged. Stage 1, denial. Stage 2, rationalization. Stage 3, confession. Stage 4, displacement. Each clip was of Chelsea, her lies, her excuses, her laughter, her breakdowns. Every emotion recorded with clinical precision, time-stamped, annotated, voice analyzed. John ejected the card in a panic. He's not just watching, he's publishing. Chelsea said nothing. She didn't need to. She said, "He won't say my name anymore, but my story, my gestures, my psychology, they're his work now, the first test of the Vanguardian protocol." That night, after John had fallen asleep, Chelsea composed an email. Subject, consent withdrawal and memory ownership appeal. To classified recipient at securedmail.net. Message, I was your wife, not your subject. Delete everything, or I will go public. C. After hitting send, she looked at herself in the mirror. The reflection was still hers, but she wasn't Chelsea anymore. She was a chipped, digitally mapped, emotionally dissected version of herself, a character in someone else's story. That same night, Dave sat in his Algarve beachside bungalow, watching the email come through on his screen. He took a slow sip of coffee and typed below it, Subject 001, Identity Response Logged. Vanguardian Phase 2, Success. In the quiet of that Portuguese coastal villa, Dave was drawing the final lines of the most intricate campaign of his life. His mornings began with lavender honey and green tea, but the spreadsheets and legal dashboards on his laptop looked less like those of a retired postal worker and more like the war logs of a sleeping spy. Chelsea was beginning to understand how this war had started, but she still had no idea how deep it ran. The implant, the surveillance, the emotional dismantling. Those were just the surface layer. The real game was played through patents, legal strategy, and corporate maneuvering. 4 years ago, right around the time Chelsea's affair began, Dave had resigned from his job, a mid-level product engineer at a biomedical tech firm. Chelsea had mocked him then. "You're quitting your job to write? Are you kidding me?" She didn't know Dave had spent months before resigning combing through internal research files, patent filings, and development logs. In Seattle, while unlocking an old USB drive, Chelsea stumbled upon something unexpected: a scanned NDA with Dave's signature. But one clause had been highlighted. Any invention or intellectual property created and filed 12 months post-resignation will not be subjected to company ownership or claim. At the bottom of the document was a date, July 23, 2019. Chelsea opened her calendar. The Vanguardian patent, filed July 29, 2020. Exactly 1 year and 6 days later. A corporate lawyer John had contacted confirmed it. Yes, that clause means the Vanguardian device belongs entirely to him. It's his personal intellectual property. Chelsea's breath quickened. She asked, "What's it worth?" The lawyer answered calmly, "Last I checked, Vanguardian is being adapted for military-grade surveillance contracts, personal safety wearables, and even advanced parental tracking. Estimated private licensing value, $380 million. John dropped his coffee cup. Chelsea's mouth went dry. She asked, "Are we entitled to anything?" The lawyer smiled politely. "Well, since you're no longer his legal spouse, and you never filed a marital claim on the IP, no." That night, Chelsea sat alone on the porch, wine in hand, eyes staring into the dark sky. John had gone to bed, maybe out of silence, maybe to a different room. She whispered, "You saw everything, Dave, and I saw nothing." Then came the final video. An encrypted link, subject line, "In case you still think it was about love." Chelsea opened it with trembling fingers. It was Dave, on that Caribbean cruise, outside their romantic suite, setting up a hidden camera. The video showed her own laughter, John's hand on her shoulder, and her voice saying, "He's sweet, but he'll never be a lion." Attached was a short message. "Lions don't roar, Chelsea. They watch. Then they dismantle your jungle. Quietly." Now Chelsea understood Dave's true intent. He didn't choose the courtroom to destroy her. He chose the contract room. He had used the law the same way she had used his emotions. Quietly, intelligently, and irreversibly. Chelsea now checked every email like it might be a subpoena. Every notification buzz felt like a warning bell. And Dave? He was now featured in the New York Times. Vanguardian founder, from suburban engineer to surveillance mogul. There he was in the photo, wearing a blazer, confident, with a digital globe glowing behind him. Chelsea closed the article. She realized Dave no longer needed revenge. He had built a brand, an empire, a protocol, and that protocol wasn't built in his name, but on the foundation of her betrayal. Chelsea was no longer a person in his story. She was the beginning of a process that she would never see the end of. That same night, Dave stood by the window of his Algarve bedroom watching the ocean. Melanie, his new assistant, walked in behind him. "Your 2 p.m. call with the NATO prototype buyers is confirmed." Dave didn't look away from the waves. "Add one more note to the patent record," he said. Subject 0. Chelsea M. Hollings. Confirmed psychological collapse within 6 months of emotional tracking deployment. Melanie asked, "Should I anonymize her name?" Dave replied, "No need." She chose exposure once. Let her remain part of the blueprint. Chelsea stared into the mirror. No John, no dignity, no stability. Just one question remained. Was I ever in control? Or was I just walking through his lab the whole time? Outside Seattle, at the base of the Cascade foothills, stood a rundown old cottage, the one Chelsea and John had rented to start over. In the beginning, the house offered them peace, anonymity, and the illusion of a second chance. like something out of an old American romantic drama. But now, 4 years later, that cottage felt like emotional wreckage. John stayed out late, always with work as the excuse. And Chelsea, the same woman who once called Dave too plain, now jumped at the sound of every door creak. The fear of Van Guardian didn't live in a chip anymore. It lived in her memory. That evening arrived with light rain. Chelsea returned home carrying grocery bags, reached for the door, and froze. The living room light was on. John was inside, and he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a young woman, mid-20s, long brown curls, visibly pregnant. Chelsea's feet wouldn't move. John looked at her, his eyes full of guilt, but also quiet resolve. "Chelsea, we need to talk," he said. She slowly closed the door behind her. A cold gust swept in with her. "Who is she?" Her voice cracked. John exhaled, heavy. "This is Amber. We met last year, at the firm, and—" Chelsea's eyes locked onto the wine bottle on the coffee table. Meritage, the same label Dave used to bring on their anniversaries. Amber spoke softly, nervously. "I didn't mean to. I thought you two were separated." Chelsea cut her off. "Oh, don't worry. I've heard that line before." John stepped forward, panicked. "Chelsea, listen to me. This isn't like us. It wasn't planned," she said, with a bitter little laugh. Amber quietly slipped into the other room, sensing the storm about to erupt. Chelsea turned back to John, tears in her eyes, but cold, composed. "Do you remember the first time you told me I was brave?" she said. "It was when I confessed I was leaving Dave." John nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. Chelsea said, "Turns out, I wasn't brave. I was just weak enough to be flattered, weak enough to mistake attention for love." "Chelsea," John began. "Don't." She raised her hand to stop him. "You didn't break me, John. Dave already did. You just added the period at the end of the sentence." John whispered, "We can fix this." Chelsea smiled, a smile born from old, smoldering ash. "Fix? You're trying to repair a frame that was never a frame. It was always a trap. A lab John had nothing left to say. That night, Chelsea quietly pulled out the last remnants from her old closet. A few books, a small jewelry box, and a handwritten letter from Dave she had never opened. She unfolded it. "Chelsea, what you took was my past. What I'm taking, is your future. And both I gave you with a smile." Chelsea placed the letter back in the box. Now she understood everything. Dave never shattered her with revenge. He observed her. He revealed her. Then he showed the world a version of her that was stripped bare. Raw. Chelsea was alone again, but not because of Dave or John. This time, she was broken by herself. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived in the cottage mailbox. From D. Frell to C. Hollings. Inside, just one line. "It's not about who breaks your heart. It's about who documents it better." Signed, Nick Buford, founder and lead analyst. Van Guardian Systems Inc. Chelsea held the envelope in her hand. It wasn't paper. It was a verdict. Amber now lived with John, and Chelsea had moved out. But John still swore some nights he felt a presence watching. Silent, precise, clinical. Dave had become a global speaker. Ethics in surveillance and the psychology of infidelity. At one seminar, someone asked, "What inspired you to start Van Guardian?" Dave chuckled, "A forgotten anniversary, a wine bottle, and a bad liar." The audience burst into applause. Chelsea no longer appeared in public. But on Reddit, a new anonymous user had emerged. Username, Exhibit 0, their first post? "I wasn't the villain. I was just the unconsented sample." Dave's beachside villa in Portugal's Algarve coast had transformed into one of the surveillance industry's most secure and discreet headquarters. On the outside, it looked like a minimalist retreat. White stucco walls, soft wind chimes, and lavender in terracotta pots. But inside, every wall was layered with logic, mathematical precision, behavioral analytics, and Dave's obsession, the Vanguardian Protocol. That morning, Dave followed his usual schedule. 5:45 a.m. meditation, 6:20 a.m. cold brew, and at 7 a.m. sharp, wiping the same Caribbean cruise photo frame. Yes, that frame, still hanging on the study wall, soft blue edges, a tropical backdrop, and Dave and Chelsea laughing. But it wasn't a keepsake anymore. It was a silent trophy. The first slide of a psychological experiment. The embedded surveillance chip inside was now obsolete. Dave had upgraded since, but he never removed the frame. Melanie, his executive assistant, walked in. The New York Times piece just dropped. They're calling Vanguardian the protocol of the century. Dave gave a faint smile. Send a copy to Harvard's ethics department. They'll appreciate the irony. That afternoon, his children came to visit. Matthew, 22, and Claire, 19. Claire hugged him. Dad, you still make the strongest coffee in the world. Matthew pointed at the photo. You still keep that? Mom's, Dave answered, steady, calm. It's not her picture. It's the moment I realized what truth sounds like. When no one's watching, but the tape is running. Matthew shrugged. We're just glad you're at peace now. Dave replied, peace isn't the absence of noise, it's the mastery of silence. After they left, Dave walked into his private lab. Behind a reinforced glass wall were the new Vanguardian prototypes, domestic models, child protection units, elderly care versions, but one black file sat apart. Project F, Frel-001. Inside was his first surveillance timeline, Chelsea's, annotated, indexed, legally certified. He placed the file into a biometric vault, retina scan protected. That evening, under a Mediterranean breeze, Dave prepared a solo dinner. Grilled salmon, lemon herb couscous, and aged Bordeaux. Soft jazz played on the radio. He sat on his terrace, the frame in front of him, and gently, like whispering to an old ghost, he said, I never broke you, Chelsea. I revealed you. And then, you broke yourself. He sipped his wine and logged in to his laptop. The Vanguardian dashboard opened. One new alert. Exhibit 0 uploaded new post. The man behind the lens had no soul, just logic. Dave read the post, scrolled, then tapped archive. Caption written. Subject Zeta. Terminal awareness achieved. Save. Log out. Looking out at the sea, Dave held the cruise photo to his chest. What I wasn't made me who I became. That night, far away in Seattle, Chelsea stood outside a women's shelter, a folder in one hand, a coffee in the other. On the folder, the title read, Emotional Surveillance and the Law, A Survivor's Perspective. Author Chelsea M. Hollings. She looked up at the sky and exhaled, deeply, slowly. She might never be whole again. But she wasn't a subject anymore. Now she was a voice. But the story didn't end there. Vanguardian had become a global policy debate. Is consensual surveillance legal? Can emotional data be commodified? And every time, Dave Frel's name came up, the man who turned his ruin into an empire. Final scene. Night falls over Algarve. Dave shuts off the study lights. He looks at the frame once more, then opens a new one from the closet. This one is blank. Inside it, the Vanguardian logo, and beneath it, one line. In every betrayal, there's a formula. I just solved mine first. He smiles. Vanguardian doesn't end, it evolves. The end.